There are two kinds of history. Official history, the kind which is taught in schools. Then there's secret history, a scandalous kind of history which explains how things really happened. This is the story of Australia's secret history. ASIO is Australia's leading intelligence agency, set up to identify spies and subversives who threaten the state from within. It has opened files on hundreds of thousands of citizens, creating a unique history of dissent. These files are dark biographies in which all suspects are guilty. Our series tells a few of the stories from the previously secret intelligence files of these persons of interest.
Secret, ASIO Minute Paper, C Branch Security Assessment. Name, Michael Dudley Hyde, born 20th of November 1945, Waverley, New South Wales. Occupation, student. Hyde is a determined opponent of our system of government. He is a supporter of revolution, insurrection, the violent overthrow of one class by another. He is an overt enemy of the system.
In the 1960s, influence and membership of the Communist Party was falling rapidly. But now a new target dominated ASIO's list: student activists.
I became chairman of the Monash University Labor Club, which is the most radical organisation in Australia. I helped organise the Vietnam moratorium campaigns. I was chairman of the Worker Student Alliance, and I was an active leading member of the Communist Party Marxist-Leninists.
Those credentials were enough to attract the attention of any spy agency. By the late 1960s, the generation born after World War II was coming to maturity. For the first time, the children of migrants and working people were receiving a tertiary education. These new universities became centres of radical politics, and ASIO now devoted more of its resources to the subversive threat of student activism. Around the world, a youth revolution was about to begin. In Australia, all that was needed was a trigger.
Before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon.
Prime Minister Menzies provided that when he introduced military conscription to supply troops for the Vietnam War. Michael Hyde would become one of the leading figures in the biggest protest movement of the 20th century, opposition to the Vietnam War.
In those days, especially the tabloids had front pages with big red arrows pointing down at Australia coming from Southeast Asia and China. And many, many people were duped and convinced that this was going to happen, that the communists of various varieties would end up walking down Bourke Street. It was the old domino theory. I remember discussing with my parents everything that gave me the shits about the world. Everything from poverty to racism, so on, war. And I can remember my father saying, well, it's no good just complaining usually, you've got to go out there and do something about it. If I was a Vietnamese living in South Vietnam and I'd just seen Colonel Lone shoot a guy in the head, summary execution, I realised that maybe if you turn the other cheek to US imperialists that were invading your country, you're just as likely to get that cheek blown apart. So when I went to Monash, I was ready for it. I wanted to find a militant left-wing group.
The Monash Labour Club was the most radical organisation on campus. Hyde joined, threw himself into political action, becoming the Labour Club chairperson in 1968, and met people who would play a large part in radicalising him. One of them was Albert Langer.
We were the sort of dynamic driving force behind a wider current that was significant, that there was a change in society in the 60s, there was a radical current, and we sort of set the agenda in Melbourne, I'd say.
It was in this lecture room where the Monash Labour Club meetings were held, And it was, in fact, the birthplace of a number of very large campaigns that affected the whole of Australia, like the Aid to the National Liberation Front of Southern Vietnam campaign. The NLF was actually the proper name for the Viet Cong.
In an act which outraged the Conservative government, Michael Hyde and members of the Monash Labour Club started collecting money for medical aid for the enemy on campus.
So this is the spot where we first set up the tables to collect money for the National Liberation Front of Southern Vietnam.
Their actions made national headlines. Michael Hyde and his colleagues now became persons of interest.
When you actually took on state power, you were going to pay. You were not, you know, they weren't just going to lay down and let you take society over. They were going to restrict you, they were going to control you, and they were going to watch every minute of your life. I became aware of ASIO probably in 1967.
The following 5 Monash University students are among those currently residing at 7 Jasmine Street, Caulfield. Michael Hyde, Keith Jepson, Dave Nadel, Chrissy Sandford, Andy, full name unknown.
You just simply accepted the fact that somewhere along the line ASIO was going to be listening and watching.
The students at the address are suspicious of outsiders and are of the opinion that their telephone is being tapped.
This is the side of 7 Jasmine Street, South Caulfield, which was the centre of lots of activity in the late 60s. For a couple of years it was the political headquarters. Originally it was, of course, a wonderful old weatherboard house, which I can tell you about, but as you can see now is a bit of a brown brick monstrosity, not to offend the owners, but, you know, it is a monstrosity. What was happening here was lots of discussion and lots of argument. It was politics central, it was Labour Club central. We'd go into the city and have a meal at Lebanese House, and then we'd end up back here. They were interested in us all the time. On the road out here, you'd see every now and then a car parked, and we'd spy them through. As a matter of fact, my bedroom was just around about there, and you could just kind of see out through the curtains, and lo and behold, there they would be either taking photos or taking down the numbers of every single car that was in the street. So unfortunately, some of our neighbours must have had ASIO files begun on them, when in actual fact they may not have been on site at all.
ASIO now opened files on students, anti-war activists, draft resistors, and pacifists such as Quakers, anyone who disagreed with government policy. The 60s were a time of social change, and old warriors inside ASIO were unable to tell the difference between youthful dissent and dangerous subversion.
Subversion is a very cloudy, grey concept that can range from just political dissent through to calling for a revolutionary overthrow of the state. So it's very difficult if you fight subversion because you don't know when it begins or where it ends.
And they're not just there just to find out what you're doing. They're there also to dig up dirt on people that they can supposedly use in order to undermine whatever good people are trying to do in order to change the world. When you give human beings, especially in an intelligence organisation, carte blanche to go and, I don't know, eavesdrop and tap phones and to follow people around and sometimes maybe even to do things that are designed to scare the hell out of people, you've got to watch the kind of people that you have in those organisations.
The problem with any security agency is enthusiasm, over-enthusiasm, getting carried away with your own theories, getting caught up with your own investigations, being convinced that there's a whole big evil empire out there. Now, the sad thing is that sometimes there is a big evil empire, and there are wicked and violent people, and against them we need surveillance and intelligence. But we don't need that against every person of a left or liberal-leaning inclination, people who favour civil liberties, people who favour rendering governments and officials accountable, people who are sometimes just again the system.
The following recorded persons were observed taking part in the demonstrations: Michael Hyde, Albert Langer, and Kerry Craig Miller.
I think this is Albert Langer. This may be the girl that he was married to, maybe still married to, and whose parents were long-time Communist Party members, and they lived in Burnley Street in Richmond.
So, I've got that silly Chinese hat on. Yeah. In 1963, when I was about 13, my father died. And I think that affected me quite a lot because I wanted to be, I guess, in some ways as good as I'd thought my father was. So naturally, when I went to Monash, I got involved in the Labour Club.
The purest form of communism was that which existed in China as pure Marxist-Leninist, which led to the establishment of the Communist Party of Australia, Marxist-Leninist.
For years, Phil Geary had been an ASIO agent inside the Communist Party of Australia. But as the followers of Chairman Mao attracted attention to themselves, he was now reassigned to the Communist Party Marxist-Leninist.
The Marxist-Leninist group were more aggressive in their attitude to how they wanted to take over the world. And they had cells of 3, and in the cell that I was in was a lady of probably early 80s, myself, another school teacher. And they were very secretive, mind you, very secretive. And they were paranoid about security, of course.
ASIO's concern was that Hyde and his cohort were secretly being directed by the Chinese. This would be subversion.
Secret. Operation Bargain. It would appear that the Communist Party of Australia is to offer a tour to China to Hyde. And should Hyde be in jail under the provisions of the Defence Forces Protection Act, the trip will be offered to another member of the Monash University Labour Club.
When the chance came to go to China during the Cultural Revolution, early 1968, I mean, I just leapt at the chance. One of the things that impressed me about Maoism was their commitment to militant action and their sincerity and their hard work.
5th of February 1965. My dear PM, you are no doubt aware of our interest in the Australia-China Society, ACS, and that the Society has been, since its inception, a Communist Front organisation. It is this society which attends to the detailed work required in arranging tours to the Chinese mainland. There's no doubt brainwashing does occur on the tours arranged by the ACS.
ASIO Inward Message, 9th of February 1968. Secret. Michael Hyde arrived Sydney this day from China. As Hyde's baggage was being searched, it was noted that he had in his possession Chinese papers, written in Chinese, and other literature. When asked what he thought of the country, he said, "Fabulous." The subject was not met at the overseas terminal.
What they were looking for was a receipt for money that given to the National Liberation Front, what was euphemistically called the Viet Cong. It was in a plastic container stuck up my arse. What we were doing is we wanted to break the Defence Forces Protection Act.
While Hyde was in China, the students moved out of Jasmine Street and into an old bakery in Greville Street, Paran. It would become the headquarters for the growing influence of the Monash Labour Club and its offshoot, the Worker Student Alliance.
The bakery became the headquarters of the Worker Student Alliance, which had a rather large number of branches. Lots of different people, not just students, were involved in these branches. It was teachers and nurses and electricians and fitters and turners and welders and boilermakers. And it was designed to try and develop a union between students and workers.
All in here
This was another room here, because I had this room here for a little while.
And I don't remember that there. But anyway, no point in arguing.
Friday nights, it was kind of like the joint to be. And so people were all kind of crowded in here. And frequently you would have either the Federal Police, Commonwealth Police, Special Branch or ASIO parked out here taking photos or...
John Michael Cassidy, known as Das, was a journalist working for the ABC. Drawn to the radical action at Monash, he brought invaluable communication skills to the struggle.
I met a lot of the Monash people and thought these are an interesting lot, being more alive, more militant, more interesting, and that, you know, was the beginning of a long connection with the Monash left.
Das Cassidy oversaw the production of Print, a radical news sheet which came out every day. This prolific output to Monash Uni and later high schools gave an inflated impression of the activists' numbers and capacity.
Well, I've got a scrapbook, which is a huge collection of press clippings from that time, and I think it's probably the best way of giving an impression of what a big impact Monash in particular had and how much we were hated. A shocking photo of me in 1969, sitting in the Vice-Chancellor's chair, I think it's 69, during an occupation. Now, I have to say I was coming down with the flu, as I found the next day, so maybe that's one reason I look so terrible and a bit sulky.
Intercept report. Kerry Langer to her sister Megan Miller. Megan indicated that they had been handing out leaflets at her school today, University High School, and the cops turned up. Miller then said they would like a speaker at the school. Langer said she would try and get Mike to come along this Friday. She remarked that it would sort of be illegal. Worker Student Alliance Conference. In order to develop links with other progressive school children, it was further resolved that a publication entitled Tabloid Underground be printed.
I'm not sure that the Marxist-Leninists were really in tune with youth culture at the time. I think they were numerically small, as I understand it, numerically small, vocally very active, which gave the impression that they were much bigger than they in fact were.
To think these students posed a threat to the state is implausible. But the politicised and out-of-date ASIO spent thousands of man-hours spying on and intimidating students.
It's not exaggerating. For many, many years, you know, you never knew when you were going to be picked up or spied on or questioned in the dead of night, and you always wondered possibly whoever you were talking to, and maybe you didn't know, you know, whether they were agents of the Commonwealth Police, the Federal Police, the Special Branch or ASIO. I can remember picking up the phone once and heard a bit of a click, and all of a sudden there was this kind of echoing thing in the background where I could hear a couple of what sounded like operators listening into our phone conversation and having chats seemingly offline. But then again, this could have been not an accident. They may well have been letting us know that they were there. It's a bit like J. Edgar Hoover said. He wanted all the left-wingers to think that there was an FBI agent behind every letterbox and under every bed. We had to take precautions, and we did take precautions. Sometimes if there were meetings, organisational meetings for rallies, we'd only let the people know who were at the meeting as to where the meeting was going to be. Other times we would not divulge anything on the phone. Other times we would take circuitous routes.
Surveillance report, October 1967. Sedan registered number GMW231 stopped on the south side of Maribyrnong Road facing west. The two males alighted. They appeared to be Peter Price and Michael Hyde.
Lo and behold, I get my ASIO files, and there it is. Every single turn I ever made, every stop, every UE, every light, every single piece was there in my ASIO file.
Dryburgh Street, Spencer Street, Clarendon Street, Bank Street, Wells Street, Dorcas Street. Humphrey McQueen to John Sinnott. Sinnott said he thought they, the Jasmine Street crowd, are losing all their nerve. He said that Michael Hyde thinks they will be arrested.
having a comprehensive file, and it's intensely detailed, it's going to have an effect on you. A number of agents would have known about you, would have known about your friends, would have known about your organisation. You just lived in those days actually on a knife edge. Probably myself came pretty close to having some kind of breakdown. I certainly, for about 6 months there, probably what I now know as anxiety was
Intercept report. Patricia Miller to Kerry Miller. Kerry remarked that Albert Langer was showing signs of strain. She said that he used to be very relaxed, but not now. She went on to say that he seemed to be taking all the responsibility now that Michael Hyde was not so active.
What appears to be a total waste of time of recording all these trivial phone conversations, they're building up a matrix of who knows who, right? So if you're considering somebody for appointment to a senior position and you realise that they've had a lot of contact with dangerous radicals, you can exclude them from that senior position. That's one thing they do with them. But in a future situation, if there's a genuine mass upsurge where they really are in trouble and they have to start organising death squads, well, then you know who to kill.
In fact, that was one of the prime functions of ASIO, to decide who would be taken off to the soccer stadium and dealt with. You know, I think we held the view that if there was a revolution, we'd probably need to do the same sort of thing.
Worker-Student Alliance Conference. Albert Langer stated that little was known of the operational methods employed by ASIO. He stated that the revolutionary struggle was essentially a race between ASIO and the WSA. He claimed that if the race is won by the WSA, ASIO operations and the entire bourgeoisie would be executed, but that in the interim period, ASIO would be striving to put all WSA members up against a firing squad.
People liked, playing at soldiers and playing at spies and whatever.
In Melbourne, the US consulate became the focus for anti-Vietnam War protests, with ASIO filming from the Chevron Hotel across the road.
In 1967, there'd been a demonstration outside the US consulate, which consisted of about 100 people. And then the rain came and it was a fairly dismal affair, but we stayed there and we realised that the authorities were looking on our demonstrations as containable. We weren't really annoying anybody or threatening any establishment. We decided that the July 4, 1968 demonstration was to ramp up the militancy of opposition to the war. If this meant throwing rocks and smashing up the US consulate, if this meant even occupying, if we were lucky enough, the US consulate, if this meant cutting the United States flag down, we would do so.
Meeting to discuss demonstrations on the occasion of American Independence Day. Hyde said the purpose of the students' demonstration was not to attack the police because they were police, but because they were there to protect US imperialism. Leaders of the Monash Labour Club, particularly Albert Langer and Michael Hyde, deliberately planned a violent 4th of July demonstration.
That's true. We were going to make it as militant as hell. We organised smoke bombs, we organised rocks to smash up the consulate. I don't know how I feel about this saying now. I mean, I don't know whether the statute of limitations, how long it is, but in any case. At a meeting of these leaders the day before the demonstration, a proposal to use petrol bombs to burn the US embassy down was defeated by only one vote. Their whole aim was to provoke the police and to use violence. And this whole area here in July 4, 1968 had demonstrators from St Kilda Road all the way up to about maybe a few hundred metres.
As if the Alliance's attitude to violence was not already well displayed, WSA Bulletin No. 1 describes some of the functions of the WSA local branch as bomb throwing, machine gunning, cop shop burning, and so on.
I cannot remember ever reading that. I cannot remember ever writing that. I cannot remember ever distributing anything like that. And if anybody in the Worker Student Alliance actually believed in bomb throwing, machine gunning and cop shop burning, no member in their right mind would put it down for ASIO to read. People got shocked and horrified about the wreckage of the windows and trying to take down the flag outside the US consulate, which we basically succeeded in doing. But there were cop cars and divvy wagons and smoke bombs going off everywhere and clattering stones. So that was probably where they found this bag with rocks, and there was petrol or something.
I did find it. I'll tell you a story about the petrol, but not one being recorded. I have to say it was about the most exciting night in my life up to that point. It was really fun.
Each year the crowds grew, as did the violence. American Independence Day became the central event for the militant left.
Operation Array, 8:25 p.m. Mike Hyde has sustained a hairline fracture of the jaw and has been taken to hospital. David Nadel said that Albert Langer has some money to help with the bail. They need all the money they can get their hands on. Intercept report. Albert Langer to Michael Hyde. Discussed a broadsheet they intended printing. He would also like to put in that certain extremist elements have suggested that a form of action should be for Monash kids to hijack an aircraft.
So I suppose when people wonder what kind of a threat we were, I think that we were a threat. Internationally, there was the Baader Meinhof, etc., but they worked on a different basis to us. We worked on the basis that if you weren't going to try and mobilise the masses, then what was the reason for it all? Often those other more international organisations took a position that really ended up in despair. And as a matter of fact, their actions of kidnapping and all that kind of stuff was really a reaction to not being effective in terms of mobilising the people against the war or whatever.
This mobilisation took the form of a broadly based community opposition to the Vietnam War and became known as the moratorium.
There were some groups and people that we got on extremely well with, even though we disagreed with. The Save Our Sons, for instance, of Jean McLean and Joan Croxedge, and I'm sure they've got ASIO files as long as my arm.
While at first they might have railed against me as a middle-class housewife, they were quite interested in the fact that we were able to assist and happy to assist anyone who needed it.
Maybe this blonde one, maybe Jean McLean, had long blonde hair, often wore knee-high boots.
Must have been so boring for the spies of Australia to have to be standing out there with people walking up and down and having small chats.
Note for record. The Vietnam Moratorium campaign has the full support of the CPA.
ASIO began to confuse opposition to the government of the day with genuine disloyalty to Australia. People who were not communists and would never be communists were deeply opposed to the commitment to Vietnam, and yet this was tantamount to being seen as disloyal to Australia.
There was a friend of mine who was killed at Long Tang in Vietnam, and his name was David Thomas, and he was a very good friend of mine, he and his family, and I was told by ASIO not to go to his funeral in case I was spotted. So I watched his funeral from on top of the hill in Forest Street here in Bendigo, which looks down upon the Salvation Army chapel, and I saw the gun carriage and all that there, and I really Oh, it was a really emotional time because not to be able to attend your friend's funeral, it took me a long time to get over that, and I find it very hard to forgive those people for putting me in a situation where I couldn't even do that.
I'm not trying to say that any member of the government is a Nazi, but I can tell you this.
Whilst individuals within the opposition Labor Party offered support for the moratorium,
we are here to end the war in Vietnam.
the Labor Party itself withheld support, fearing violence would damage their image. The Conservative government branded the moratorium a communist front and requested ASIO files to prove it. And though the Communist Party endorsed the moratorium, they couldn't control it. Like ASIO, the Communists failed to understand that this was a broad-based community movement beyond the control of individual political groups.
Unbeknown to many of those people who took part in it, the organisers, as I understand, may have had motives other than just protesting against the war.
I think the essential dispute in the moratorium was to whether to take a position that was pretending to be just for peace in Vietnam, or whether to be openly saying we want the Vietnamese to win. And the Maoists and WSA people in the moratorium, especially in Melbourne, were very strong on the fact that our aim was to win.
A public meeting of sponsors for the Vietnam moratorium campaign was held in Richmond Town Hall. This meeting passed a motion to remove the words that all actions taken be of a peaceful, non-violent nature. One speaker said that the stoning of the US consulate in Melbourne on the 4th of July 1968 had been an effective form of protest. The Vietnam Moratorium Committee in Victoria...
It is considered that the undermentioned personalities would fall into the category of persons known to have used or advocated violence.
Clearly the Prime Minister and most Liberal and Labor politicians of the day aren't here. This government, this society is based on violence. Eventually the powers that be are going to oppose you with their army and with their police force and with their guns. And if you were serious about changing the world, a number of us would have argued for the armed overthrow of the state.
ASIO's secret report, Vietnam Moratorium Day. About 12:30 p.m. on Friday, 8th of May 1970. About 20 buses, each containing approximately 40 students, left Monash University for the Treasury Gardens. When the moratorium march took place down Burke Street, the Workers' Student Alliance was at the front of the marches. Agents' comments. When other marchers returned to the Treasury Gardens at the request of the marshals, a group of Monash and Melbourne students decided to march to the Melbourne University. Agents' comments. There is little doubt that Langer desired more militant action at the moratorium, and he was definitely frustrated by the actions of the moratorium organisers in not cooperating with the students and even taking things out of their hands at the last moment. Cairns has
Monash students were frustrated by the docile moratorium, but the demonstration to mark American Independence Day, which they would control, was just 7 weeks away. There they could show their political power in direct action, as European students had.
Lecture by Keith Windshuttle on the student movement. The discussion centred around student revolution. Windshuttle stated that the only way in which the present society is to be overcome is by violent revolution by the students.
what's the point of being a youth if you can't have youthful excesses? I think people had a naturally romanticised conception of things, and they enjoyed causing trouble, and that's the way youth should be.
4th of July demonstration, 1970. Jim announced that a meeting had taken place as to whether the demonstration should take place on either the 3rd or 4th of July. During the whole of this time, the Monash group was breaking into little groups at the rear of the hall, in a manner not unlike the comic Three Stooges conferences.
There were large monopolies like Westinghouse, General Motors, Dow Chemicals, making huge profits out of the Vietnam War. So we occupied the Careers and Appointments Office in order to bring this home to people.
It was subsequently learnt that the real reason for the takeover was to have access to the printing and copying machines available in the Careers and Appointments Office. The militants desired to use this equipment to print pamphlets for the 3rd and 4th of July demonstrations.
Despite student support, leaders of the occupation were summoned to appear before university authorities.
Intercept report. Kerry Craig Langer to her mother, Patricia Isabel Miller. Miller said that the whole of her life had been wasted.
Oh, and my mother, gee, that's sad. She says she felt the whole of her life had been wasted and that we were going the same way.
She referred to her late husband. She indicated that he had said that he hoped that Kerry would never join the party.
And she's distressed that I've become a communist and obviously feels that it's not worth it.
Kerry indicated that she should hear tomorrow from the university if she had been expelled.
And then I'm being very optimistic and committed.
Kerry remarked that she would get her degree. She would just have to wait a year to get it.
You know, I'd rather do something about things that were wrong than have a meaningless life.
She asked her mother not to be unhappy, not to worry about her. She was very happy with what she was doing.
3 students were expelled. Kerry Langer, now married to Albert, Michael Hyde, and Jim Bacon, the future Premier of Tasmania. Failure to agree on a date for the demonstration was a symptom of the fragmenting left. They ended up holding 2 demonstrations, one during the day on July 4 and another more militant one the night before, July 3rd, with numbers attending split between the 2.
By the late 1960s, the ASIO was being used regularly by Liberal Party ministers as a kind of private research service. They would have a troublesome activist in their electorate, and backbench MPs would ask that an investigation be done.
ASIO had spied on members of the Labor Party since 1949. Prime Minister John Gorton asked for details on police trouble Labor MP Jim Cairns had been in. The ASIO Director General reported that Senator Wheeldon was possibly collaborating with the KGB. The ongoing effort to connect the Labor Party to communism had long benefited the government and its spies, but that relationship was about to end. Some of the people ASIO had watched were about to become its new masters. 23 years of Conservative rule came to an end in 1972 with the election of a Labor government.
3rd of January 1973. Note for record. Prime Minister's attitude towards ASIO. At my first meeting with the Prime Minister, Mr. E.G. Whitlam, he admitted that he was not very well disposed towards ASIO, although he realised that such an organisation was necessary.
Prime Minister Whitlam instructed ASIO to disconnect all phone intercepts and reapply for connections. He would not approve phone tapping of students or unionists.
The Prime Minister said he was inclined to think that the government would not require ASIO to be too much concerned with communist activity in the trade unions. He said that both Mr. Cameron and Mr. Hawke were experienced operators in the union field, were aware of the communists, and would attempt to deal with them in their own way. The Prime Minister said he would like to think that targets for ASIO's attention were not exclusively on the extreme left. He mentioned the Croatian nationalists. I assured the Prime Minister that ASIO was stepping up its efforts in this field.
They were, connecting Croatian extremists, the Ustasha, with Michael Hyde and Albert Langer.
Members of the Ship Painters and Dockers Union had stolen a quantity of light weaponry destined for the Australian military forces in Vietnam. The stolen arms were sold to and are now in the hands of the Ustasha at an unknown address.
Well, you know, that just doesn't even make sense. I remember people referring to this. I certainly knew nothing about it. I think the motivation is to paint the bullseye on us a little thicker, especially because weaponry is involved. Stolen arms being sent to the Ustasha, it's a well-known fascist organisation. It's just bloody nonsense.
Fearing it was withholding information on Croatian terrorists, Attorney General Murphy made an unannounced visit to ASIO's headquarters in Melbourne, accompanied by a large contingent of Commonwealth Police. He demanded access to the files and scoured them for anything that would support his concerns. Within hours, alarm bells were ringing in Britain and the US. This breach of security left their intelligence services exposed and ASIO in line to be cut off from all Allied intelligence. Compounding the concerns of Australia's allies, the new government moved to withdraw from Vietnam and end conscription.
Certainly, even though I probably denied it at the time, certainly when conscription became less of an issue, there were less people possibly prepared to move on to the streets.
Over a course of about 2 years, you suddenly got the growth of a radical movement and a fringe revolutionary movement. And we had the illusion that it would just continue growing, whether at the same rate or not, whereas we didn't realise that it was in fact a particular wave and that it would die away. And the fact is, as you say, when it died away, we were left adrift.
Some of the things that you see in Monty Python's Life of Brian are actually quite good representations in a humorous way of the tendency to splinter over in increasingly trivial differences.
Greg Smith, and here is his own ASIO record number next to his name, recently stated that a number of Worker Students Alliance personalities, including himself, believe that Mike Hyde to be a police spy. Now, I remember reading this. I was away doing some writing, and I remember reading this particular memo, and kind of getting a bit bug-eyed about this.
Now, there definitely was a poisonous atmosphere that developed in WSA, and I was saying earlier that I didn't think it was created by ASIO. I think it was the sort of poisonous atmosphere that does spontaneously occur in left groups, where people would be accusing each other of being police spies and so on. So Greg would have been one of the people that would go around with that kind of poisonous atmosphere. But certainly Mike and I would know that neither of us sort of ever regarded each other as police agents.
2 agents came up from Melbourne, gave me lunch, had a bit of a chat, and then said, "Phil, well, this is it. We don't need you anymore," and handed me over a certificate from the Director General, which was all nice and well done, and it said, you know, we appreciate all that you've done for us and all this sort of stuff. And then they said to me, well, you can't keep it, we've got to take it back, but we just wanted you to know it'll be on your file. And when they left, you know, I saw them drive away and I thought, there goes 23 years of my life.
Secret report. Mike Hyde, president of the Worker Student Alliance, said that he considers that the WSA should be disbanded. Deleted commented that he cannot understand Hyde's attitude, and although Hyde dominates meetings of the WSA Central Committee, he now seems to be determined to destroy the organisation and appears to have no interest in it.
To contain the political damage caused by Murphy's raid on ASIO, the Labor government appointed Justice Robert Hope to head a royal commission to investigate the intelligence service. For the first time, light would be shed on what the commissioner later called ASIO's obsession with the left.
Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Are you a member of the Communist Party?
Disturbed by his discoveries, Justice Hope recommended the immediate dismissal of Director General Barber. Prime Minister Whitlam agreed, and the Director General of ASIO was removed. But the Labor government would not survive long enough to hear Justice Hope's findings. The dismissal of the Labor government became fertile ground for conspiracy theories. But whatever the truth, a unique era in Australian life was passing.
I gave Gough Whitlam a letter from the Director General of ASIO which related to the ASIO or the United States relationship with the Australian government. I have no idea of the contents of the letter, but I understand that there was some tension between the United States government and the Australian government over the passage of sensitive material of whatever sort, I don't know, political or military. That was the day before he was sacked.
Justice Hope found that a number of ASIO investigations into foreign espionage in Australia came to sudden and inexplicable conclusions.
I believe that during the 1960s, there was a person inside ASIO who was passing material to the KGB. And I believe that during the 1980s and early 1990s, there was at least one person in ASIO passing information to the KGB. I believe that the individual concerned was a very senior member of ASIO, though not in fact the director.
For all the misguided efforts and thousands of man-hours spent watching and demonising students, it wasn't ASIO that finally brought student revolution to an end. It was life in a rich country. The impetus that Vietnam had provided was gone, and student militants were now finishing university degrees.
Sometimes I look at whether my faith in Chairman Mao was misplaced. I can't give you a straight answer on that. I know what they achieved and I know lots of the mistakes that they made, so if I had any kind of blind allegiance to the Cultural Revolution or to Chairman Mao, which I probably did have in my youth, then I could say it was to some extent misplaced.
When you're young at 19 and naive, you felt, you know, a real buzz about that, thinking that you were going to really do something for your country. And that was always at the back of your mind, that you were going to do that. And in the end, I certainly did it, but I'm not proud of it.
The organised left was in decline, but ironically they had succeeded with many of their policies. Women's liberation, environmentalism, justice for Aborigines, and Australian cinema, literature and art flourished. Across the board, people were acting out the manifestos of militants who themselves now began to assume some of life's responsibilities, families and jobs.
Langer mentioned during this conversation that Mike Hyde and Aileen Hyde were having a baby. She added, Albert might be having one too.
Albert Langer applied for a job in the post office, and Mike Hyde wanted to be a teacher, but security reports are forever and came back to haunt them.
He has applied for employment to the Commonwealth Public Service. This could well be a staged affair. Even if it is not staged, this is an important case. We would appreciate it if you would obtain current intelligence on this fellow. Hyde is a determined opponent of our system of government.
He's a supporter of, quote, revolution, insurrection, the violent overthrow of one class by another. I suggest that it would be an act of crass lunacy to give Hyde access to classified material. I also suggest that it would be dangerous even to employ him in the public service. He is an overt enemy of the system. It was things like this that clearly were being fed to the Education Department too. I actually did apply for the Commonwealth Public Service because I thought, oh, well, this is at least it's going to put bread on the table and a roof over my head. It's sometimes been suggested that with Workers' Student Alliance and with Labor Club and student activity and anti-war activity, there are people getting married or living together or having children or moving into other jobs, but the majority of those people, I'm happy and proud to say, took their progressive, enlightened, left-wing views and took them into different industries in order to try and get people on side in those industries as well, teaching and public service, you name it. When you're faced with insurmountable odds, you've got to understand that things can very, very quickly change. You don't become downhearted, you keep on plugging away. And after all, in 1967, outside the US consulate, there was maybe 100 people demonstrating against the war. 3 years later, across Australia, there was 250,000, and in the streets of Melbourne, there was 110,000. I've never forgotten that lesson.
Oh, I never wanted to be a Quasimodo's dream. Shall I beg the ringmaster, please find another me? Oh, I never wanted to be Quasimodo's dream.